You should practice Stablemates. End of lesson. Don't listen to him. You should absolutely practice giant steps. You're both wrong. If you want to be a true student of the music, you need to practice both. So who's right? Stablemates, giant steps, both? Today, we are looking at these two classic but challenging standards to determine how the choices we make in the practice room about what tunes we invest time in impact our progress as jazz trombone players and improvisers. What's up, everyone? Thanks for joining me this week. Today we are digging into two pretty challenging tunes. That is Benny Golson's Stablemates and John Coltrane's Giant Steps. Now, both of these tunes have some real difficulties that we need to overcome as improvisers. But today we're not going to talk about sort of the what to practice on them, but also a little bit about why we might choose to play one tune or work on one tune over the other one, and how that can kind of impact various areas of our playing. I definitely have my opinion about which tune I prefer playing and enjoy playing more. We'll get to that a little bit later in today's lesson, but both of them are essential to understanding particularly sort of the modern jazz landscape. So let's jump into Stablemates first. So when we're thinking about Stablemates and we're thinking about why we might want to practice this tune, we've got to think what we can really learn from working on this tune. It uses mostly what we might consider functional harmony, 2-5-1s, things of that nature, pretty sort of standard issue harmony, but Benny Golson has sort of stretched them to their limit also almost about how they can be applied. Lots of things that maybe don't resolve in the strictest fashion, but sort of adjacent to the strictest fashion. So this tune can really help us understand how to use or how to play over tunes that use functional harmony, but sort of stretch to the max. This is really, really typical of sort of 60s era blue note type of tunes. I'm talking about tunes like Dolphin Dance, like Bolivia, lots of tunes from the Wayne Shorter library. These all use harmony in this sort of way. So this is a great tune to practice that sort of approach to harmony. Since we have a lot of harmonic motion that moves in semi-unconventional ways here, a great avenue to help us move through these changes and create good ideas is really working on our ability to manipulate motives or small melodic ideas. I think that's really essential on these sort of tunes because creating either through eighth note lines can be particularly challenging, but also it gives the listener sort of something to grab onto and makes our solo sound a little more melodic, even if we're moving these sort of disparate chord changes around. So all these different motives that we're going to work on today are available in the free handout that's over in the virtual studio. So click on the link down in the description. I think this is a really good week to check some of that stuff out because there is actually a fair amount of information in there about manipulating these motives. Let's start on the A section. So our first chord in Stablemates is an E minor 7 chord. So we want to think, can I create some different motives on E minor? We are going to use 4 notes: the root, the flat third, the 4, and the 5. Once we've defined sort of that motive, we can manipulate it and vary it in lots of different ways. Am I ascending? Am I descending? Am I skipping any notes? Lots of variations you can make on this very classic 4-note grouping. So once we have all that stuff sort of worked out, we figure out what shapes we like, we're going to plug some of these into the tune. I would start by putting them every place where there is a minor chord and resting for the rest of the song, just to start. Now, there are a few places in this song that have minor 7-5-5, that sort of stuff. I'm going to be pretty strict here and only plug it in where there is just a minor 7 chord. So that takes care of some shapes on the minor chords we can use. What about on the major or dominant chords? We can think about a similar approach. Still using 4 notes. In our case, we're still going to use the root, the third, in this case the major third, and the 5th, but instead of using a 4th, we're going to use the 2nd. I would call these two shapes tetrachords. That's not necessarily the strict definition of a tetrachord, but for me, a tetrachord is any 4-note grouping that lives inside of a 5th. Of range. Lots of little ideas you can use manipulating these sort of shapes in jazz. So here again, we're going the root, the 2nd, the 3rd, major 3rd, and the 5th. We then take those motives, do the exact same thing where we plug them into the tune. Again, there's a little variation here. We could apply this anywhere there's a dominant chord or a major 7 chord. However, there are a few dominant chords in here that are either sharp 5 or maybe they're flat 9, flat 13. Since this particular idea has the 5th scale step in it, we are not going to play it on those. There are also some chords that have flat 9s here. Now, you could vary the motive to have a flat 9 in it, or in my case, I'm just going to plug it in with a natural 9. To me, that 9 is maybe a little more negotiable than like a sharp 5 or a flat 13. So just keep that in mind as you're applying these, that you may have to be somewhat flexible on how you apply them, changing the motive slightly. You'll figure that out when you get into a tune and are working it in this fashion. One other element of this motivic style of playing that you may find helps you land this stuff better. For example, here in the first measure, when I played that descending motive, the and a 4 was a B natural because that's the 9 of the A7 chord. But usually when we have that and a 4 and we leave it hanging there, it actually anticipates the next chord. So rather than playing this, at the end of that first measure, you might find you like it more if you anticipate what's in the next chord, which would be a B flat. Now that changes the motive, but in the context of the song, it's going to make a lot more sense. This may also be useful in the next measure where you would be anticipating on the and a 4 the chord tone that fits into D flat major. And then maybe finish it out, in a slightly different way or in a similar fashion. So you have to work on these in a very strict sense at first, so that way you can then manipulate them to make them fit in the context of the tune. Now, you also might find that there are some motives that work across multiple types of chord qualities. For example, if we choose a motive or a shape that has a 5th, a flat 7, and the root on top in it, it could actually work well on minor or dominant 7. That's very effective on the bridge of this tune because it only has minor or dominant 7th chords. So we're going to take this motive, C, E flat, F, that's the 5th flat 7 root, and maybe we'll try to apply that in a little more musical fashion through all of these chords on the bridge. All right, that takes us through some stuff for Stablemates. I really love motives on that tune. I think it's a very effective way to practice that tune and similar tunes to it, which are many, as I mentioned. Let's go to giant steps. So when we're thinking about giant steps, we want to ask ourselves the same question. What does giant steps allow us to practice? Not just in sort of a specific sense of, I want to play on giant steps, but how can the skills we work on apply to multiple different tunes? So giant steps is a very specific set of chord changes. There aren't necessarily a ton of tunes that move by these thirds like giant steps does as far as their key center. So when we're working here, it can really help us get in touch with this very specific type of chord progression, which is obviously going to help us here. It could help us on some other Coltrane tunes that use a similar set of chords. The other thing that I think giant steps is great for is helping us build connections through fast moving chord changes. These chords are like unrelenting. It's basically 2 chords per bar for almost the entire tune, and they're always shifting key centers that don't always fit together in the strictest sense. They're always 5-1, but the way these key centers are grouped is not our typical thing. So it can really help us, if we can get a handle on it, be able to make melodies, make lines through these really quick moving chord changes. In all honesty, that's one of the more challenging aspects of this tune, is just getting it up to tempo. Now, if we think about what we're going to practice on this tune, guess what? It's the same thing. It's motives. Now, there's lots of things you could practice on this tune to get your playing together on giant steps. It's the same way that there are many things you could practice on Stablemates. But I think this idea of motivic playing really cuts across both of these tunes in a great way that we can really use as a way to organize our practice. Now, the typical way to think about motives on this tune, or I think the most common way that people cite, is this sort of thing. Now, that is the classic sort of approach that was recommended to me when I first started working on this tune when I was a younger improviser, you'll hear Coltrane play some ideas like that in his solo. However, I found that this approach of just like, hey, let's take a motive, transpose it through all the keys, and that's going to get you to the ideas, didn't necessarily help me on this tune, in all honesty, because it was just very hard to execute in many cases. So I really had to think of a slightly different way to work on this tune. Aside from just a lot of slow practice, the other thing that really helped this tune click a little bit for me was realizing that I needed to break these motives up. And rather than just thinking about them as single shapes, thinking about them as sort of like a set of notes, almost like miniature scales. This is where that variation practice we started out with really pays off. So you've got to think about being able to break them up and say, all right, well, maybe I just play the motive on the major chord and play something else on the dominant chord. Or do the opposite, play something else on the major chord and play the motive on the dominant chord. If we look at both phrases, whether I was applying the motive on the major chord or on the dominant chord, the other stuff that I chose to play was mostly still the note groups that would be in the motive. For example, in the first 4 bars, we've got that B major 7 motive, root, second, third, 5. On the D chord, rather than playing the whole motive, I just played the root up to the 5th, down to the 3rd, up to the G natural on the G chord. So finding those other little kind of broken up shapes that are in those motives, they're going to allow you to execute cleanly. It's probably going to help your solo sound a little more melodic, a little less pattern based. And it can also just sort of free up your mind because you can realize, oh, I can move these motives in lots of different ways, and you don't get sort of stuck in the rut of just running these patterns on this tune that you've practiced. Surely some practice needs to be done there just to sort of gain an understanding how the chords move. But as soon as you can get to breaking this stuff up, I think you'll find that it really clicks, especially when we put it in the context of the whole tune. So there we go. Stablemates, Giant Steps. If you made it this far and are interested in knowing, hey, Shawn, which tune do you like to play more? I like to play Stablemates. In all honesty, Giant Steps is not a tune that I really enjoy playing. Stablemates is just a tune that is more fun to play with other people, for me. There's no real specific reason other than that. When I play Giant Steps, and definitely when I was practicing Giant Steps a lot when I was a younger musician, it felt too much like sort of a rite of passage tune. That like there was a way you were supposed to play on it to sort of like prove that you were like a young jazz musician that had it together. And that is just an immediate turnoff to me. You know, that is just not something that I'm interested in doing. Yeah, you got to practice Giant Steps. You got to practice both of these tunes to really gain command over the entirety of the language. But for me, as soon as something is like, hey, you have to play a certain way on this tune, I just don't want to play it, in all honesty. I think you also have to consider when you're choosing whether you want to work on these two challenging tunes about how much do you practice the blues? How much do you practice the ballad? How much do you practice intonation? Obviously, we all have limited practice resources as far as time, and we need to choose them wisely. I can tell you, I haven't played Giant Steps on that many gigs, but I've played 1,000 blueses and a ton of ballads, and have had to worry about whether my intonation is good a lot more than I've had to worry about if I can burn down Giant Steps at 300. So just take that with a grain of salt as it sort of hopefully guides you where to invest your practice time, and we'll see you in the woodshed.